the Emperor Augustus, who was Tiberius' stepfather and adoptive father. And that's the coins with the inscription and the impression of Tiberius Caesar. Remember when Jesus took up the coin and says, whose name and superscription is this? And they said, Caesar, that's him. Now, you may say then, well, big deal, Jesus was baptized in 27 AD. Coincidence, right? But that's not all the criteria of the prophecy, brethren. There was more to the prophecy. The prophecy says, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. So now, the first time period we remember, 49 actual years, ended in 408 BC, when Jerusalem was restored. The second time period extended from that 434 years into 27 AD, and at that time we saw Jesus being anointed Messiah. But the prophecy now says after that Messiah shall be cut off. What does it mean by cut off? It means Jesus will be killed. But it says, but not for himself. In other words, we know that Jesus was crucified. Crucifixion is a capital punishment for criminals. But Jesus was not a criminal. In fact, the Bible tells us Pilate, which is the Roman governor, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and the people said unto them, ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverted the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found what? No fault in this man touching those things where you accuse him. Nor yet Herod. Herod also, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death. So Jesus was not deserving of the punishment, the capital punishment that he received. So if Jesus was not cut off for himself, who was he cut off for? The Bible says in Isaiah 53, he is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so opened he not his mouth. For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people he was stricken, not for himself, but for you and I. He was cut off for the sins of the world. Now we remember the prophecy said, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and he, the Messiah, shall conform the covenant. Notice it's specific. It's not a covenant. It is the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. What is the covenant that is mentioned here in Daniel's prophecy? We remember in the Old Testament, God had promised he would make a new covenant with the Jews. Remember that? In Jeremiah 31:31, God said, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So Jesus came, or the Messiah came, to conform this new covenant. And we see that because Jesus ministered only to the Jews. Only to the Jews. His message of salvation and the gospel was to the Jews only. Look what Jesus told his disciples. Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So the covenant was to be conformed with the Jews, the house of Israel. Even though many Gentiles happened to be at Jesus' sermons, but his messages were directed to the Jewish nation. Now, the Bible tells us Jesus, on the night before his death, said to his disciples, Drink ye all of it, talking about the cup of wine. For this is my blood of the New Testament, or the New Covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. So Jesus establishes the New Covenant. Jesus came to shed his blood to satisfy the death penalty which he accepted in the Garden of Eden. And when he did that, he had allowed Adam and Eve, and as well as us who are unborn, to have the opportunity to live and accept God's invitation to be in his new kingdom, which he will make. The Bible tells us in Hebrews 9:15, for this cause Jesus is the mediator of the New Testament, or the New Covenant, that means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of inheritance. Look at this. Jesus' death redeemed those who are under the first covenant. In other words, his blood reached back into history and saved those who are in the first covenant, all the way back to Adam and Eve. And also his blood, thank God, reaches forward from the cross to save us also. Now, according to Daniel, this covenant was to be conformed with many for 1 week. Now remember, in Daniel we have a prophetic key that says 1 day is a year. So 1 week would be 7 years. So this covenant was to be conformed for a period of 7 years. Not only that, it says in the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. So if a prophetic week is 7 years, how much in the middle of that would be? 3.5 years. So in 3.5 years, sacrifice and oblation, the Messiah will cause those things to cease or to stop. And let's see how we arrive at that 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry. If we go to the book of John, we will see that in John chapter 1, verses 31 and 32 talks about Jesus' baptism. About half a year passes, and in John chapter 2, verse 13, we find a Passover. And then a Passover happens every year, by the way. So the next, in John chapter 6, verse 4, we find another Passover, which means a year has passed. In John chapter 11, verse 55, we find another Passover, which means another year has passed. And then finally, in John chapter 19, verse 14, on the day of Jesus' crucifixion, we find a Passover, which means 1 year, 2 years, 3 years and a half, 3.5 years, Jesus ministered as Messiah. And then he was cut off at his crucifixion. Just what the prophecy says, that in the midst of the week, he will cause sacrifice and oblation to cease, because the Bible says in Hebrews 10, 12, 14, but this man Jesus, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God, for by one offering he had perfected forever them that are sanctified. In other words, Jesus' sacrifice was one that lasted forever, so you didn't need any more. So he caused sacrifice and oblation to cease when he offered himself as sacrifice. So no more are blood of bulls and goats needed. We have a sacrifice that lasts forever. Now remember that the prophecy also said that in the midst of, he shall conform the covenant for 1 week. Even though in the midst of that week, the 3.5 years he was cut off, he had promised to conform the entire 7 years of the covenant, right? So if Jesus died in the middle of that 7 years, there remains 3.5 years still for the covenant to be conformed. So how did Jesus manage to conform the remaining 3.5 years of the covenant? The Bible tells us Jesus speaking to his disciples, this is also